So welcome to the book Nine Shift. This book came out in 2007. Blew my mind, and I started, this really became my teaching philosophy, or the way that I was going to approach teaching for the next, what has it been, almost 15 years. So I'm going to read it because I try and always give you an audio version, but today instead of someone famous, you're stuck with me. So Nine Shift. Work, Life, and Education in the 21st Century by William A. Draves and Julie Coates. In just 20 years, between 2000 and 2020, some 75% of our lives will change dramatically. We know this because it happened once before. Between 1900 and 1920, life changed. Okay, that's the Victorian age to the modern age. Nine Shift explores the uncanny parallels between today and 100 years ago, examining the changes between the two transition periods and the forces that restructure society in the new economic era. Discovering each of the major nine shifts currently taking place and find out the implications of each shift for business and work, life, and education. Come explore the excitement of the 21st century. Welcome to our story, Nine Shift. Okay, so I'm going to now move to the first chapter. Moving. Okay, first chapter. And this is the chapter we're going to discuss. It says, I am not a futurist. I only describe the present to the 98% of people who are not there yet. This is by Richard Thymé, technology expert. In just 20 years, between 2000 and 2020, some 75% of our lives will change dramatically. We know this because it happened once before. Between 1900 and 1920, life changed. We moved from an agrarian farming way of life, Victorian, to an industrialized modern way of life. Now it is happening again. The way we work is changing. The way we live is changing. The way we learn is changing. These changes are causing tremendous uncertainty, doubt, anxiety, and stress. Those of us who are adults grew up in the industrial age of the last century. We are now moving from a time in which we were fairly certain of the basic facts about life and the rules that applied to it, to a time when we are not quite sure what is real and what is not. This ambiguity will be with us for another 10 to 20 years. Living with the ambiguity and feeling comfortable with discomfort is not easy. Our purpose in writing this book is to discover how our lives are changing and to understand what lies ahead by looking back at our great-grandparents' generation, the generation that was alive during the last time society experienced such a dramatic change. We call this dramatic change in how we work, live, and learn a nine shift. What nine shift means? The term nine shift is used to describe the great changes taking place in our lives right now. What we are experiencing and how we use our time and how we will experience life derives from the phenomenon that 9 hours in your day will be spent entirely different in 2020 than they were spent in 2000. There are 24 hours in a day. We have no real discretion with roughly 12 of those hours. We need to eat, sleep, and do a few other necessary chores in order to maintain our existence. That hasn't changed much through the centuries so far. That leaves approximately 12 hours a day where we as individuals do have some discretion. That includes work time, playtime, and family time. Of those 12 hours, about 75% or 9 hours will be spent totally different a few years from now than they were spent just a few years ago. Not everything will change, but 75% of life is in the process of changing right now. The same kind of change occurred between 1900 and 1920 as well. Frederick Allen called it the Big Change in his 1952 book by the same title. We call it a 9 shift. What this means is that 9 hours in your day will be spent entirely differently in 2020 than they were spent in 2000. That is an enormous change. That is a 9 shift. The last time we experienced this 9 shift in society was between 1900 and 1920. The driving force of the last century, the 20th century, was the automobile. The automobile and the way the automobile was made, the mass production factory, shaped how people worked, how people lived, and how they learned for the last 100 years. The auto is not a symbol for the 20th century. Instead, the car and the car factory literally changed most of life. So many common features of life today would not have been widely present without the car. They include offices, suburbs, remember suburbia we talked about, A&P? Fast food restaurants, company organization charts, unified school districts, and many more aspects of life that are considered standard today. People in society are so dependent on the car that to do without one for a week would be an enormous burden for the majority of us. We simply have no readily implementable backup plan to working and living without a car, even for a week. The car shaped and defined the 20th century. It had an almost negligible impact on the 20th century. And as we will see, the automobile is going into steep decline and will have a much reduced and non-dominant role in the 21st century. Now, there are arguably more important inventions than the automobile. Electricity and the printed book are two examples, but neither shaped the 20th century as the auto did, and neither were confined to the 20th century like the auto has been. Electricity had a much greater impact on society in the 19th century than the auto, and it will have a much greater impact on society in the 21st century than the auto. The importance of the printed book has continued for 500 years, and even with the advent of digital communication, it is unlikely that we will see its influence wane in the newest age. As we did see, the internet is behaving exactly the same way as the automobile did 100 years ago in its impact on society. The auto is not used here as an analogy, which is defined as something somewhat similar. Instead, the influence of the internet on our lives is exactly a replay, a mirror of the influence of the auto on society 100 years ago. The outcomes will be different, of course, but the forces and how those forces interact and change our lives are the same. This book is not really about the internet. It is more about the consequences and changes of the internet and how the internet is changing how we work, live, and learn in this century. It is about the tremendous transition from one way of life to another that we are undergoing between 2000 and 2020. To understand what has happened already in the 21st century, to understand what is happening today, and to understand what will be happening between now and 2020, all we need to do is revisit the years 1900 to 1920. Most of all the fundamental changes in our society in this century will take place before 2020. We know this because most of all the fundamental changes in 20th century society took place between 1900 and 1920. In 1900, society was in the agrarian age. The predominant occupation was farming. A majority of people either lived on the family farm or in a small town, less than 2,000 people. We will explore more what life was like then, but most of us have little knowledge about life in the 1900s. In just a short period of time, just 20 years, society went from being an agrarian society to an industrial society. By 1920, almost all the major inventions of the century had seen the light of day. They included radio, movies, airplanes, the gasoline engine, and more. Okay, I'm going to stop here and remind you that I talked about in the story that I love so much. The book, All Quiet on the Western Front. I did not make you read that book, but I talked about it because it dramatically showed the shift between 1913 and 1917. When World War I started, the war, much of what was happening included horses. Horses were carrying men and equipment, and that was in 1913, and the start of the war in the book. And in the end of the book, in 1917, the first airplane came over and dropped bombs. And that's 3 years' time, or 4 years' time. Imagine going from 1913 to 1917 from horses to airplanes. Huge, huge, dramatic shift. Also, remember that when we were talking about There Will Come Soft Rains, someone in their research found that in 1945, the only major appliance, electrical appliance, that people had in their homes at the time were electric irons. And so after that time came all the other things that you see in the story. And much of that came with the end of World War II, when manufacturing shifted from manufacturing guns and armaments and airplanes to creating appliances for the modern consumer, the rise of General Electric. Okay, so we're talking major shifts in society here. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the read. About the only device to have a major impact on us that had not yet been invented was the television. Yet even there, the visual language for television was established by 1920, according to the television and communications expert Kathleen McMoneagle. More importantly, by 1920, almost all the major aspects of 20th century life had emerged. They include suburbs, commuting, offices, factories, the National Football League, women's right to vote, and possibly most importantly, the ubiquitous organizational chart or pyramid. So the time period to analyze is 1900 to 1920. Life in the 19th century before 1900 looked a lot like life in 1900. And life in the 20th century after 1920 looked fundamentally the same as life in 1920. The leading business thinker metamorphosis from the industrial age to the internet age has been Peter F. Drucker, who invented the term knowledge worker. Notes Drucker, both in its speed and its impact, the information revolution uncannily resembles its two predecessors within the past 200 years. The first industrial revolution of the later 18th and early 19th century, and the second industrial revolution of the late 19th century. Drucker notes, the next society will be a knowledge society. Knowledge will be its key resource, and knowledge workers will be the dominant group in its workforce. And he concludes, all this suggests that the greatest changes are almost certainly still ahead of us. In this book, we will take 2 magical mystery trips. One will be back to the time of your great-grandparents, give or take a generation, depending on your age. The other magical mystery trip will be forward just a few years. Both scenarios will be very unfamiliar. Both are equally exciting and ripe for exploration. And again, we are now in 2020. So we are at that point where this trip is going to take us. There are 2 halves in the period of transition from one society to another. The first half, the first decade, 2000 to 2010, is characterized primarily by the unraveling of the old society. The second half, the next decade, 2010 to 2020, will be characterized primarily by the reformulating of society around the new way. So many of you, the 9/11 generation, the generation born into the 21st century, you have seen both of these, but chances are you've not been aware of them because they have been your norm. At the juncture of the 2 decades, around 2010, is the turning point from the old society to the new society. Here are the critical time periods we will look at: 1990 to 2000 and 1890 to 1900. Technology was first introduced, intellectual excitement and creativity. Okay, 2000 to 2005 and 1900 to 1905. New ways grow, old way becomes dysfunctional but is still dominant. In 2005 to 2010, at 1900 to 1910, conflict and chaos as the new way challenges the old way. Okay, this is particularly true in education, and many of you will notice that that there's still many people who want you in a seat doing flashcards, learning your ABCs, learning the times table, learning the multiplication charts, learning the states' capitals. This is the old way that included factory-style memorization and learning in an 8-to-5 model in a classroom, and so there are many people who continue to think we need to go back to that way. But there's been a shift in education. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Okay, 2008 to 2012 and 1908 to 1912, turning point. Okay, I'm going to just, 2010 to 2020 and 1910 to 1920, old way gives way to new way. And 2020, that's where we are, and 1920, new way is clearly dominant and accepted. The old way is clearly in decline. Okay, many of you know that I have tried my best. Actually, for the last 15 years, I've tried my best to do old-fashioned things like having people have notebooks and pieces of paper and taking notes in class. But you know I don't fight it, and what do I tell you to do? I write all the notes on the board and tell you to take pictures of it with your cell phone. Okay, because I know that nothing I do is going to convince you to write this stuff down. So the old way is clearly in decline. Taking pictures with cell phones is clearly dominant and accepted, even by old way teachers like me. Some of these changes in life are fairly fundamental. For the sake of symmetry, we're going to describe 9 of the most important changes coming and going on right now. What we know, and what many other technology and economic experts have widely documented, is that the internet and the World Wide Web in particular, yes, that's what it used to be called. You know why we have like WWW, World Wide Web? That's when it was new. That's when Yahoo, which of course to you is old, Yahoo was still a chocolate drink and not a browser. Let's see. The World Wide Web in particular is a profound new technology that has already fundamentally affected our economy. We know that we are moving from an industrial economy to an information economy. We know that the number of knowledge workers is dramatically increasing and will become a significant part of the workforce. From this, we are alone at present in predicting that all of these 9 shifts are occurring and will become commonplace by 2020. Okay, I'm going to stop here and then start a new video. 1, so that it's easier to upload, and 2, so that you can possibly think